The story of the Vikings is often told through images of fierce warriors, burning villages, and longships cutting through stormy seas. But this popular image only captures a small part of who the Vikings truly were. Between the late 8th century and the early 11th century, Norse seafarers from the rugged lands of Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, developed one of the most remarkable maritime cultures in human history. Their ships crossed vast and dangerous waters long before modern navigation existed, connecting distant regions through exploration, trade, and settlement. While many historical accounts focus on Viking raids against monasteries and coastal towns, the Vikings were also sophisticated traders who created vast commercial networks stretching from the icy North Atlantic to the bustling markets of the Middle East. They carried furs, amber, iron, walrus ivory, and slaves across continents, exchanging them for silver, silk, spices, and exotic goods that traveled thousands of kilometers before reaching Scandinavian shores. Their trade routes linked the Baltic Sea to the rivers of Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean world, and even the Islamic caliphates. Viking merchants sailed through narrow fjords, crossed the open Atlantic, and navigated winding river systems like the Volga and Dnieper, establishing trade posts and settlements that became hubs of cultural exchange. These networks were not random adventures, but carefully maintained economic lifelines that supported growing Scandinavian societies. Archaeological discoveries reveal Arabic silver coins buried in Swedish soil, Byzantine jewelry in Viking graves, and Asian goods found in Nordic trading centers, proving that the Vikings were deeply integrated into global commerce centuries before the modern idea of globalization emerged. Their success depended on a unique combination of shipbuilding mastery, navigational skill, and an adventurous spirit shaped by the harsh landscapes of Scandinavia. In lands where rocky soil made large-scale farming difficult and long winters limited resources, the sea became both a highway and a source of opportunity. Young Norsemen grew up surrounded by water, learning to row, sail, and navigate by the stars, the sun, and the flight patterns of birds. The longship, perhaps the most iconic Viking invention, was not merely a war vessel, but a technological masterpiece designed for speed, flexibility, and endurance. Its shallow draft allowed it to travel across open oceans and also move upriver into the heart of continents, giving the Vikings unmatched mobility compared to other medieval cultures. Because of this, Viking traders and explorers could reach places others considered impossible to access. They established trading towns such as Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in present-day Germany, and Kaupang in Norway, centers where goods, languages, and cultures blended together. In these places, merchants from distant lands met Norse traders, exchanging products, stories, and knowledge about unknown worlds. Over time, these encounters created a vast web of connections that stretched across Europe and beyond. Viking traders became intermediaries between civilizations, transporting goods between the Islamic world, the Byzantine Empire, and Northern Europe. Silver from Baghdad could end up melted into jewelry in Scandinavia, while Nordic furs might travel south into markets thousands of kilometers away. This dynamic trade system fueled the Viking Age and transformed Scandinavian societies from isolated northern communities into powerful players within a much larger economic landscape. Yet the Vikings themselves likely never imagined that centuries later, historians would view them as pioneers of early globalization. To them, these journeys were simply part of life, an extension of curiosity, survival, and the constant search for opportunity across the endless horizon of the sea.
Long before the Vikings became known across Europe, the people of Scandinavia were already deeply connected to the sea. The geography of their homeland shaped nearly every aspect of their lives. Norway's jagged coastline stretched thousands of kilometers, carved by deep fjords that cut far into the land like narrow corridors of water. Denmark consisted of islands and peninsulas surrounded by shallow seas, while Sweden faced the vast Baltic coastline filled with rivers that led deep into the interior of Eastern Europe. For the Norse people, traveling by water was often far easier than traveling across land. Dense forests, mountains, and long winters made overland journeys slow and difficult, but the sea offered a natural highway. Generations of fishermen, sailors, and shipbuilders gradually transformed this geographic necessity into an extraordinary maritime culture. Children grew up hearing stories about distant lands beyond the horizon, and many young men dreamed of one day sailing far from home to seek wealth, glory, or new opportunities. The Viking longship became the symbol of this maritime world, but it was also the key technology that made their vast trade networks possible. Unlike many ships used in Europe at the time, Viking vessels were built using a technique known as clinker construction, where overlapping wooden planks were fastened together with iron rivets. This design created ships that were both lightweight and flexible, allowing them to bend with the movement of waves instead of breaking against them. The result was a vessel capable of surviving the violent storms of the North Atlantic while remaining fast and maneuverable. Some ships could travel astonishing distances in relatively short periods of time. A well-crewed longship could cross the North Sea in only a few days, linking Scandinavia to the British Isles and continental Europe. Even more impressive was the ship's shallow draft, which allowed it to sail into rivers and shallow coastal waters where larger vessels could never go. This meant that Viking traders could sail from the open ocean directly into the interior of continents, reaching towns and markets far from the coast. Navigation across such enormous distances required remarkable skill. Viking sailors did not have compasses or modern maps, yet they managed to cross vast and often dangerous seas with surprising accuracy. Their navigation methods relied on a combination of environmental knowledge and practical experience passed down through generations. They observed the movement of the sun during the day and the position of stars at night. They paid attention to the direction of waves, the color of water, and the flight patterns of seabirds that often indicated nearby land. Some historians believe they even used special crystals known as sunstones, which could help detect the position of the sun through clouds or fog. Whether myth or reality, it is clear that Viking navigators possessed an intimate understanding of the natural world that allowed them to travel confidently through unfamiliar waters. These maritime skills turned the Vikings into some of the most effective explorers and traders of the medieval world. Their ships moved across the North Atlantic toward Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the shores of North America centuries before Christopher Columbus. At the same time, other Viking groups sailed eastward across the Baltic Sea and entered the vast river systems of Eastern Europe. From there, they traveled along the Volga and Dnieper rivers, creating trade routes that connected Scandinavia with the wealthy cities of the Byzantine Empire and the powerful markets of the Islamic world. These Eastern traders became known as the Varangians, a name that would later appear in the chronicles of both Byzantine and Slavic historians. Through these routes, enormous quantities of silver flowed northward into Viking lands, while northern goods moved south into markets that had never before encountered products from the cold forests of Scandinavia. Trade quickly became one of the most powerful forces shaping Viking society. While raiding often brought immediate wealth, commerce created long-term prosperity. Trading towns began to grow in strategic coastal locations where merchants could gather and exchange goods. One of the most famous was Birka, located on an island in Lake Mälaren in present-day Sweden. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of artifacts there, including Arabic coins, Byzantine jewelry, and glass beads from distant regions. These discoveries reveal how connected Viking traders were to the wider world. Markets like Birka were not just places of commerce, they were crossroads of culture, language, and religion, where travelers from distant civilizations met face to face. As these trading centers expanded, they began to reshape the Viking world itself. Wealth from trade funded the construction of ships, fortified towns, and powerful regional kingdoms. Scandinavian leaders realized that controlling trade routes could be just as valuable as conquering territory. As a result, some Viking expeditions were organized not simply to raid, but to secure strategic locations along important maritime pathways. Harbors, river mouths, and narrow straits became critical points within the growing network of Viking commerce. By the 9th century, this network had already grown into a complex system linking Scandinavia to much of the known world. What had once been scattered coastal communities were gradually transforming into societies deeply integrated into international trade. Yet the Vikings were not merely transporting goods, they were also moving ideas, technologies, and cultural influences between distant civilizations. Every voyage carried stories of foreign lands, unfamiliar customs, and new opportunities waiting beyond the horizon. Over time, these exchanges would change both the Viking world and the regions connected to it. The sea routes they pioneered would shape the development of trade in Europe for centuries to come, leaving a legacy far greater than the image of raiders that history often remembers.
As Viking trade networks expanded, certain locations became vital hubs where goods from many parts of the world converged. These trading centers were far more than simple marketplaces. They were dynamic settlements filled with craftsmen, merchants, travelers, and sailors who arrived from distant lands with ships full of valuable cargo. One of the most important of these centers was Hedeby, located near the base of the Jutland Peninsula in what is now northern Germany. Hedeby sat at a strategic point between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, allowing traders to transport goods across a short overland route instead of sailing around the entire Scandinavian peninsula. This location transformed the town into one of the busiest commercial centers of the Viking Age. Merchants from Scandinavia, the Frankish kingdoms, Slavic territories, and even distant parts of the Mediterranean gathered there to exchange goods and information. Archaeological excavations at Hedeby have revealed workshops where craftsmen produced jewelry, tools, weapons, and decorative items, showing that the city was also a center of manufacturing in addition to trade. Another major trading settlement was Birka in Sweden, which thrived during the 9th and 10th centuries. Located on an island along important Baltic trade routes, Birka became a gateway connecting Scandinavia with the vast river networks leading deep into Eastern Europe. Ships arriving from the east brought furs, honey, wax, and slaves gathered from the forests and settlements of the Slavic world. In return, Viking traders supplied weapons, iron tools, textiles, and other manufactured goods. Silver coins from the Islamic world flowed steadily into Birka, and thousands of these coins have been discovered buried in Scandinavian soil. The presence of Arabic inscriptions on these coins offers powerful evidence of how far Viking trade connections extended. It was not uncommon for silver minted in cities like Baghdad or Samarkand to travel thousands of kilometers before being melted down and reused by Norse craftsmen. Further west, another important trading center known as Kaupang emerged in Norway. Though smaller than Hedeby or Birka, Kaupang played a crucial role in regional trade across the North Sea and along the Scandinavian coast. The town connected Norwegian resources, especially timber, iron, and animal products, to the broader Viking trade network. Traders sailing from Kaupang often traveled to the British Isles, where they exchanged goods with both Viking settlements and local populations. Over time, these journeys created complex economic relationships between Norse merchants and communities throughout Britain and Ireland. What made Viking trading towns particularly remarkable was their diversity. While Scandinavian traders dominated the markets, people from many different cultures lived and worked within these settlements. Archaeological findings show that Slavic pottery, Frankish glassware, Byzantine jewelry, and Islamic coins were all present in the same trading centers. This suggests that Viking towns were multicultural environments where merchants from different regions could interact, negotiate, and share knowledge.
Languages, customs, and religions blended together in ways rarely seen in other parts of medieval Europe. Trade itself covered an astonishing range of products. From the cold northern forests came furs from animals such as foxes, martens, and beavers, which were highly valued in warmer regions. Walrus ivory from Arctic waters was another prized commodity, used to create decorative carvings and luxury goods. Amber from the Baltic coast was traded widely, often crafted into beads and ornaments. Iron, produced in Scandinavian bogs and forests, was exported to regions where metal resources were scarce. Viking traders also dealt in textiles, weapons, glassware, and finely crafted jewelry. However, not all Viking trade involved luxury goods. One of the most controversial aspects of their commerce was the slave trade. Captives taken during raids or acquired through trade in Eastern Europe were often sold in major markets along Viking routes. These individuals were transported to wealthy cities such as Constantinople and Baghdad, where they could be sold for significant sums of silver. Slavery was a common practice across many societies during the early medieval period, and the Vikings became deeply involved in this system as intermediaries connecting different markets. Despite the harsh realities of some aspects of their commerce, Viking traders demonstrated remarkable organizational ability. Successful expeditions required careful planning, cooperation among crew members, and a deep understanding of distant markets. Merchants needed to know where certain goods were in demand and when the best trading opportunities would appear. They also had to maintain relationships with foreign leaders and trading partners who controlled key ports and river routes. These networks were maintained through diplomacy, alliances, and sometimes strategic marriages that strengthened ties between different communities. Over time, the success of these trade routes helped transform Scandinavia society itself. Wealth accumulated in the hands of powerful chieftains and emerging kings who controlled important ports and shipping fleets. This new economic power contributed to the rise of more organized political structures within Scandinavia. Regions that had once been loosely connected tribal territories began evolving into early kingdoms such as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Trade did not simply enrich individuals, it reshaped the entire political and social landscape of the Viking world. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Viking trade was its scale. From the frozen shores of the Arctic to the bustling cities of the Byzantine Empire, Viking merchants connected regions that had rarely interacted directly before. Their ships carried goods across seas and rivers, linking distant cultures through commerce. In doing so, they created one of the earliest large-scale trading systems in medieval Europe, an economic web that stretched across continents and left traces that archaeologists continue to uncover more than 1,000 years later.
While the western voyages of the Vikings across the North Atlantic are often celebrated in popular history, their eastern journeys may have been even more significant in terms of trade and long-distance commerce. Viking merchants from what is now Sweden began traveling across the Baltic Sea and into the vast river systems of Eastern Europe during the 8th and 9th centuries. These traders, often called the Varangians, developed routes that connected the cold forests of Scandinavia to the rich and sophisticated civilizations of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Unlike the open seas of the Atlantic, these journeys required navigating complex networks of rivers, lakes, and portage routes, where ships sometimes had to be dragged across land to reach the next waterway. Despite these challenges, the Vikings mastered these inland routes and turned them into some of the most profitable trading corridors of the medieval world. One of the most important of these routes followed the Volga River, which flows southward into the Caspian Sea. Viking traders sailed from the Baltic coast into rivers that eventually connected to the Volga, allowing them to travel thousands of kilometers deep into Eurasia. Along this route, they encountered the Bulgar trading cities and eventually reached markets connected to the powerful Abbasid Caliphate. Here, Viking merchants exchanged northern goods such as furs, honey, wax, and slaves for enormous quantities of silver coins known as dirhams. These coins became so common in Scandinavia that thousands have been discovered buried in hoards across Sweden, Denmark, and other parts of Northern Europe.
Many of these coins were minted in distant Islamic cities such as Baghdad and Samarkand, showing just how far Viking trade connections extended. Another major route followed the Dnieper River, which led south toward the Black Sea and eventually to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This journey was dangerous and physically demanding. Viking ships had to pass through several treacherous rapids along the river, forcing crews to unload cargo and drag their vessels across rocky terrain before continuing downstream. Yet the rewards were enormous. Constantinople was one of the richest cities in the medieval world, filled with grand markets, luxurious goods, and powerful political influence. Viking merchants arrived with valuable commodities from the north and returned with silk, wine, jewelry, spices, and other goods rarely seen in Scandinavia. The Byzantine Empire quickly recognized the value of these northern traders and warriors. Many Vikings eventually entered the service of the Byzantine emperors as elite soldiers, known as the Varangian Guard. These warriors became famous for their loyalty and strength, guarding the emperor himself and fighting in major military campaigns across the empire. Some of these men returned home to Scandinavia with stories of the magnificent city they called Miklagard, meaning the Great City, which further fueled the imagination of future Viking travelers. Along these eastern trade routes, new towns and settlements began to emerge. One of the most famous was Novgorod, located in what is now northwestern Russia. Originally a Viking trading outpost, Novgorod became a powerful commercial center, linking northern Europe to the interior of the Eurasian continent. Another important city was Kiev, which eventually grew into a major political and economic hub, controlling the southern river routes toward the Black Sea. These settlements formed the foundation of what later became known as the Kievan Rus, a powerful medieval state that blended Norse leadership with Slavic culture and traditions. The Vikings who traveled these eastern routes were not only merchants, but also cultural intermediaries. They carried ideas, technologies, and artistic influences between civilizations that rarely interacted directly. Through trade with the Islamic world, Scandinavian societies gained access to advanced metalworking techniques, intricate jewelry styles, and sophisticated systems of currency based on silver coins. At the same time, northern goods such as furs and walrus ivory became valuable commodities in distant markets. What makes these eastern networks particularly remarkable is their sheer distance. A Viking trader could begin a journey in the forests of Sweden, sail across the Baltic Sea, travel through rivers stretching across Eastern Europe, and eventually reach markets connected to the Middle East. The entire journey could cover thousands of kilometers and require months or even years to complete. Yet these voyages were repeated generation after generation, gradually strengthening the connections between distant regions. Over time, these trade routes helped reshape the map of medieval Europe. Settlements along the rivers grew into major cities, and the wealth generated by commerce encouraged the rise of new political powers. Scandinavian influence spread across large areas of Eastern Europe, leaving traces in language, archaeology, and historical records. At the same time, the Vikings themselves were transformed by these interactions. Exposure to foreign cultures introduced new ideas, religions, and technologies that slowly changed life in the north. By the 10th century, the Viking world had become deeply intertwined with global trade systems stretching across continents. Their ships no longer carried only raiders searching for plunder, but also merchants participating in one of the most extensive trading networks of the medieval era. The rivers of Eastern Europe had become economic highways linking Scandinavia to some of the richest civilizations on Earth, proving that the Vikings were not merely warriors of the sea, but also master architects of long-distance commerce.